All right. Hi, everyone. This is Conversations with Dom, brought to you by I'm Breaking Into Tech. I'm your host, Dom Gomes. Today, I have the pleasure of bringing on a good friend of mine, Barron Lee, longtime consulting and customer success leader. So a little background here, Barron and I both worked at Salesforce back in 2015. So we've known each other for about 8 years now. We both worked in the same team in Salesforce's customer success group. Aside from being good colleagues and friends, I've always looked up to Barron for life advice. Like, for example, he helped me understand the home buying process and how I should think about money. So I always thank him for that. So, Barron, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, what you studied, all of that stuff.
Great. Thanks, Dom. And nice to meet everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here today to talk about breaking into tech. A little bit about myself. Like Dom said, we both were on the same team at Salesforce many years ago, and we've stayed in touch. As Dom, you've moved to several different roles since then. But my background is I was at Salesforce for 9 years. Prior to that, I was doing other what I will call large scale or enterprise consulting or implementations for several years. And if you want to rewind a little bit more in terms of my background, the unique thing here is that my undergraduate degree is actually in biology, right? So I actually did a pivot right out of school. With that said, I will say, looking back, that I've always had a underlying inclination or preference or desire to go into some form of technology. I do remember, Dom, when you were telling me about this podcast and what to think about. I do remember when I first went and applied for college, I actually got in under bioengineering. So it was an engineering and biology kind of hybrid degree at the time. So that right there kind of tells me, when I look back, that, hey, I wanted to do something in the technology, engineering type field. And I moved that from there over to cognitive science. And then from there, I realized I was kind of running out of time in terms of graduating. So I just switched to biology, but I still had that underlying desire. And then when I moved into grad school, to get my master's in public health, I still continued that theme of technology, which is what led me to my first role as a consultant in the technology space.
So why don't you tell us about that first role? Like, so what'd you end up doing? And,
yeah. In terms of, I would say, non-traditional paths to get into consulting, if you think about a lot of people in undergraduate, they know they want to go to consulting, either their parents or their friends. They kind of knew about it. So they follow that traditional path of interviewing for it in the fall, trying to get an internship, or once you graduate, you apply and get into one of the, what they call big, at the time it was Big Six, but now it's like Big Four, like Deloitte, Capgemini, Price Waterhouse, things like that. So I didn't go in that route. So I graduated from grad school. I knew I wanted to do consulting, but because I didn't follow that path, recruiters didn't necessarily understand, how do you recruit someone or hire someone or even interview someone who is interested in consulting and technology, but doesn't have any experience and has a master's degree, right? So I got a little bit lucky. I had a few friends in the industry, and they were able to help me interview at certain companies. And that was kind of my first big break at a smaller company where I kind of learned the basics of consulting.
That's interesting too, because I had a similar experience where I ended up working for Accenture. And I know you worked at Deloitte too, but I came in as an experienced hire. But my first consulting gig was for a much smaller company too. Yeah. And then I got recruited out of there, essentially.
Yeah. I think one of the things that people don't emphasize as much is that my first job, literally, I came out, worked there for about 2 years, and it was really the network that I built, the people that I met that were either on my team, larger teams across the company, even customers. That network is what helped me land my next job, which was at Deloitte Consulting, right? So one of my peers, she had been working at my first company for a while. So when I came in, she had already been there a couple of years. She moved on to Deloitte Consulting, saw that they were hiring, saw they had a big project, and the demand for resources was there, and helped me navigate that process and got me into Deloitte. So another interesting fact is I've had several jobs since then. Every one of my jobs with the exception of my most recent one at Salesforce, was through someone I knew who heard about a role and reached out to me and said, "Hey, I think you'd be great for this. Let's talk." So I can't emphasize how much the value of a network is as you kind of grow into your career.
So even taking it back, just because our audience might not be understanding of what consulting is, right? And I mean, if you needed to give a 30,000-foot view of what a consultant does on a day to day, and like what are their metrics that they're measured on? How would you describe what consulting is? Because it's a pretty unique role, how I think about it, right? If I remember my time in it too as well.
If you think about any type of business, or even, let's use an analogy. Let's just say you are a homeowner, or you are about to be a homeowner, and you're going to buy a house, but you want to do some work, right? And it's more than just changing the light bulbs or light fixtures. You want to actually take out a wall, build a new bathroom, like something that's going to require some professional expertise, as well as knowing how to navigate things like permitting and supplies. That person that comes in, that general contractor, and then all the people that the general contractor brings in to help with specific areas, that's kind of what like a consultant is, right? So if you think about in the business world and technology, companies are always buying some type of solution. So back in the day, when I first started, software as a service, or the cloud, as we like to call it, didn't really exist yet. It was very nascent, and everything was still what we call on-premise, which means a company had to not only buy the software, which they usually had to download or get on a big CD and then install it. So they also had to buy the hardware, so the databases, all the things that a company would need to run software. So a consultant is basically, you're a specialist for either a specific product or service, and you're hired by companies to come in. It could be you, it could be a team. Usually it's a team, right? And your job is to, over the course of a certain amount of time, depending on what's in the contract, which we call a statement of work, your job as the team, as a consultant, is to implement or install that software or install that solution, right? Some companies, once the solution is installed, much like your iPhone or your Pixel phone, it gets updates every so often. That software has to be updated every so often. So then companies, if they don't have their own internal teams with the skills to understand how to update, they will reach back out to another team of consultants, maybe the same team that installed it originally, or a different team, to say, hey, we need an upgrade, we need help with that, and then you come in. So I think, Dom, one of your questions was, how are you measured? As a consultant, it's all about utilization, which is basically how much of your time was billable for the project, right? So out of a typical week of 40 hours, how many of those hours were you billing to do the work for that specific customer or client?
Yeah, and I always tell people about it too. I think that interesting part about consulting in general is that you can instantly prove your value because they charge you out by the hour at a specific rate.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be much more than what they're paying you as an employee.
Exactly, right. So a lot of your hourly wages, so to speak, a lot of that goes towards paying for the overhead and the cost of running the business, right? So unless you're running your own consulting firm, right, and it's just yourself, that's a little bit different. But even if you were running your own firm and you had your own consultants, right, you charge a certain hour, but then you have to take out a percentage to run the company, and then you pay the rest to your employees or your consultants.
So just out of curiosity, because I'm curious how it was for you versus me. You went to that small company. What was it like going from a small consulting firm to one of the biggest in the world? Because I did the same thing going to Accenture, and it was eye-opening.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I knew I was joining a larger team, right? So my original company was a small team. We had smaller projects. I would travel around the country doing specific parts of implementation or installation, and those usually took maybe a week or so, and then we would finish up either remotely. Or if we had to go back out to do some testing, we would do that. So that was pretty basic, and I think it really taught me, what does it mean to do an implementation? What does it mean to do an installation? What are some of the gotchas or things that might happen when you do an implementation, and how do you prepare for those, right? So I got some of those basics. When I moved to the larger company, everything I was doing in terms of team size, complexity, project management, those are some of the things that you are coming across as a consultant. Everything went up maybe 2-3x, right? Because the projects were just much larger. The teams you were on, I actually joined a project that was what we call ramping up. So it was recruiting a lot of resources, growing, because they were in the phase of they had just sold it and they had an X amount of time to staff it, right? So I think one of my biggest projects, we were probably up in the hundreds in terms of consultants, and the weekly burn rate, or the weekly amount of dollars being spent on our team was really, really eye-opening when I first found out.
Oh yeah, I mean it's intense when you start seeing that. And in that big project, what was your main role? Were you a business analyst? Were you a project manager, a program manager?
Yeah, I came in as a business analyst, and that's really where I started learning more about what we call in the technology industry the software development lifecycle, right? The SDLC. So there's different phases when you're doing an implementation. So I came in as part of a team that was documenting requirements, right? So requirements, if we go back to that house analogy, if you're trying to build a new bathroom or a kitchen or something, there's usually blueprints, right? And the blueprints will tell you, okay, here's where all the plumbing goes, right? Here's where all the basic framing for the structure goes. Here's where electricity goes. And then everything, as you build out those things, here's phases of, I think the framing has to go in first. And then once that goes in, then you put in plumbing. And then, right? So there's a sequential logic to that. So I came in as requirements. So the requirements is one of the very first phases in the software development lifecycle, because once you have requirements, then you hand those off, you get those approved by the customer saying, yes, this is the functionality we want. And then that moves into, they start building or coding or developing. So a team of developers will take your requirements, which are in a very structured format, and they start building the actual solution, right? And we call that, at the time, it was custom development work, because a lot of solutions required custom either interfaces. You had to talk to old systems. Integrations, yeah. So different from today, where we talk about low code or no code or declarative builds. Back in the day, it was custom development, and then once you build it, you obviously have to test it, right? So the next phase is then testing. You have huge teams of testers, and there's different types of testers. There's what we call probably just technical testing in the very beginning, where it's just really technical architects making sure things are working behind the scenes at what we call the infrastructure or metadata level. And then you have what we call user acceptance testing, where you have actual users who are going to be using this solution in the end. Once it's ready, they will go through and run through the specific scenarios that we've crafted to say, yep, this is how I do my job. This is how it's going to improve my job, or this is how it's going to improve my productivity. And once testing is done, we have the big go live. So go live is where everything is done, everyone agrees, and then you kind of flip the switch and you turn on the solution, and then you have your first set of users using the actual application on go live day.
So go live would be the equivalent of, I bought the house and I'm moving in.
Yeah, or the contractor says, hey, your bathroom's done, everything's working. You sign on the dotted line, final approval, final check, and then they leave, and then you get to use your bathroom, right?
Yeah, no, I like the building a house analogy, because I think it really resonates with people who want to understand what this type of role is. So and I think another thing that people, and out of curiosity, what your experience was compared to mine, at least at Deloitte, one of the things that you'll hear a lot, right, is that consultant lifestyle is, Monday through Thursday, you might be on site. You could be on a plane across the country. For the entire week, you're racking up those hotel points and those airline miles. Did you end up doing a lot of travel too? Like I did.
Yeah, that's the other, I would say that's the flip side of the coin in terms of consultant lifestyle. So because you're on these projects, and usually back in the day, we didn't have as much solutions in the cloud. So you had to be on site at the customer location doing the work, because all their all their employees are there, right? So I was traveling Monday through Thursday, which was a normal schedule. And then you fly back Thursday, and Friday, you would be doing some in-office activities, trying to wrap things up for the week before turning around and starting over again the following week. So it's definitely something that's, depending on where you are in your career, where you are in your life, I would say it's geared more towards people who are single and have more flexibility, right? Because you are spending a lot of time away from home.
Oh, yeah.
But the flip side is you meet a lot of people, and the camaraderie, the team building that everyone goes through. I remember some of the projects we had. We were, I don't remember the phase specifically, but we had to do some presentations coming up, and we were at 2 a.m. running all the Xerox machines on 4 or 5 floors to print out copies of presentations that we were going to give at the end of that week. So you're working hard, but you're working with a huge team. You're all in it together, and that's kind of where you build these amazing relationships. And I always say that my days at Deloitte and Salesforce were probably, in terms of working with the best people, those were the best.
Oh yeah, I remember those days too, and it's funny that you were mentioning the Monday through Thursday, because I wasn't single when I started at Accenture, but I remember I was living in LA at the time. I'm originally from the Bay Area, but I was traveling to pretty much the place I just moved from.
Yeah.
Monday through Thursday for like 6 months.
Yeah.
And we ended up moving back just because it was like, all right, well, if I'm going to be, I moved to LA to be closer to my, my girlfriend and wife at the time.
Yeah.
Not at the time, she's still my wife, but she was my fiance, and then we got married. But during that project, I was going back and forth, and it was tough because I would only really see her on the weekends. But I was living in like a hotel out in Cupertino. Oh no, I was in Milpitas. So I was there right off of 880, and it was fun. Perfectly like what you mentioned. I met some of the best people. I still talk with a lot of those folks too, because you just don't forget about them. But like, it took a toll on just your personal life, being able to see people.
What's amazing is I look back and I know 2 coworkers who at the time had just had babies.
Oh wow.
And and I have two younger boys now, and so after going through this, and I look back and I think, how did these people, or at their age, get through all this? Because I had a hard enough time as an older parent getting through, and I can't even imagine how they did it back in the day, just having a baby. And I do remember one of the families, the team made an accommodation, and so instead of staying in a hotel, they rented a corporate apartment. So this specific coworker and his family with their newborn, he didn't travel, so they just temporarily lived in this apartment for like 3 months, and that made it easier, right? So he could be there with his family, but also still continue to do the work.
Oh yeah. I've definitely heard stories like that, and as a new father, like I loved my time. I met great people at Accenture, but like, man, I don't know. I mean, just getting used to the lack of sleep. I don't know how I would do it with a job like that, where you can be in an office till 2 a.m. Working on a deliverable to get it done, and then coming back, and then like, oh wow, my baby hasn't slept, and I have to feed him. My baby's going through. My son's going through his first cold right now. So
no.
He's fine, but it's tough.
It's tough with babies. They can't talk. They can't tell you they're congested. They can't tell you maybe they have a fever. So you're kind of guessing, right? And it's challenging.
Totally is challenging. But to that point, like the level of camaraderie, but not even just camaraderie, the skills you learn in those jobs will help you for the rest of your career.
Absolutely. All of I don't remember everything, but I became a really good at Excel at the time, right? So Google Sheets didn't exist. It was all Excel. I was using a PC. I knew all these great shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts. I could create macros, pivot tables, and then also building a presentation. That's a big thing in consulting, building a presentation, having to go through multiple rounds of review with your manager, their manager, and then the final stakeholder and who you're going to present to. That process is can be eye-opening, but also you really learn how to be concise, what it takes to communicate, understanding what who your target audience is, right? So changing your presentation based on who the audience is going to be, and also learning how to present. I think those are all skills that even if you're not in consulting, and you go into some other career sales or career path, those are all skills that are, in my mind, very transferable and cross a lot of different roles.
Definitely that, understanding the presentation, but then also I think even going back to even getting requirements. Most of the time when you're talking with a customer, they have what you would call is what they're currently doing, the as is or the current state. And then you help paint the picture of what that future state's going to look like through requirements, process diagrams, being able to have data lives, and all of that. You're going to use that stuff in general in most of your jobs because everyone is at a current place and they want to go somewhere better. It's the gist of business.
I would say, creating executive presentations or even weekly project summaries. It's almost like going back to your grammar school days of writing book reports, right? You can write everything you want in these presentations, but one, if you can't speak to it, or if you create a presentation that your audience can't understand, there's too much on the slide. So those are things that you learn in terms of what's going to resonate and what's going to make an impact with the message you're trying to get across. Those are things that I definitely learned over and over again and refined in my consulting days.
Totally makes sense. And during the whole process where, like, I think the technology you were helping implement, right? Were you focused on anything in your background, like in terms of biology? Like you said, you had a public health master's. Were you working for healthcare provider or, healthcare companies and all of that stuff?
Great question. My graduate degree was essentially an MBA for healthcare. Right. So I focused on, I'll just call it IT or information systems in healthcare. And that's what really led me to my first job, which then led to Deloitte. And when I was at Deloitte, I worked on, this was back in early 2000s when electronic medical records were the big thing. And a lot of large providers across the nation were implementing these electronic medical records. Today, it's amazing. It's like I can open my phone and use my chart, see all my records, see my test results. That didn't exist back then because everything was on paper, right? So I think in terms of what I was using for my background, I had the knowledge of how healthcare systems, how healthcare insurance and policy, I had all that understanding, what the challenges were. But in terms of the actual, I would say, technical skills, and back to things like, I talked about requirements, learning what an implementation is, those were learned on the job, right? So eventually it became a point of, I learned some of a lot of the technical skills of typical implementations, but then you combine that with my existing industry knowledge, which continued to grow as I was doing more and more of these projects, as you're learning things like in healthcare, there's a thing called the revenue cycle, right? How do healthcare providers and payers maximize their profit? So those are the things that you learn, and you just add on to what you started with.
No, that's great. We tell that a lot to people. Is like, if you're in a certain industry or there's something that you see, use that as a basis to try to make that your angle to get into, some sort of a job. Like if you're selling to healthcare and if you work in healthcare and life sciences and you want to get a sales job, look to try to sell to the healthcare vertical. Or you're in government, look at public sector type positions where you have these consulting firms that focus on public sector. I think there's a huge emphasis that we try to tell people on this program is like, you don't have to learn everything brand new. Take what you know and apply that. And
I think the availability and the access to all that type of information today compared to when we first started out is, I think, it's amazing, right? So like you said, if I wanted to pivot and move into financial services or move into manufacturing, think about one thing I tell people in these situations who are maybe making a career pivot or trying to move into something that they're not maybe comfortable, is that the underlying concepts. So if we take a sales role, right, the underlying concepts are going to be the same. At the end of the day, you've got to sell a product, sell a service. There's usually a price, right? You've got to understand how to read your audience, understand their business challenges, and then you come up with a solution and then price it and then sell it, right? That's very 50,000 foot generalization of sales, but that's common across the board, across a lot of industries. Now, the difference now is, do you know the lingo?
The terminology.
Do you know the terminology of that specific industry? Because that is where it's going to help you as a salesperson build the trust and the relationship with the customer or potential customer you're trying to sell to, right? So that's one thing over and over again that I think, Dom, you and I at Salesforce learned, sometimes the hard way, but other times, we had to work with sales to understand, if we're going to a meeting with a customer, what do they expect? Use their language, right? Listen to them, understand them, but use their language and use specific examples of where we might have done this before, using that language so that we make, again, our impact to the audience is greater. And hopefully at the end of the day, the sale closes, right?
Exactly. And a good example would be if we're using the motif of healthcare, for example, since it's your background, don't go into a healthcare focused meeting calling the quote unquote customer a customer. It's a patient, right?
Patient, yeah.
The people that are using the system, that's not like, a rep or a customer support.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's a healthcare provider.
Yeah. I mean, you could also, you could also be selling within healthcare, you could also be selling to other, like you said, other providers. So there could be patients, other providers. If you're selling into a insurance type company in healthcare, right, then maybe they'll have more traditional roles that aren't as healthcare specific. But yeah, you got to know who your customer's customer is, know that terminology, and then know what are the unique challenges that those end users in that industry are facing, so that you can, again, understand not only how your solution or your service is going to help, but really show the customer that you know what you're talking about and you have the experience.
And the metrics they care about, right?
And the metrics, how they're measured on, right? At the end of the day, everyone's looking for business value, right? So if I spent $100 on a service, did I get $100 worth of value at the end of the day when all is said and done? Back to my other point, I just remembered when I was saying the availability of all these resources, a lot of companies these days, especially I would say Salesforce, even Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they have online content that's free that you just need to go and look, and you can sign up, register, watch a webinar, go through some online courses just to get a high level understanding or introduction around a specific concept. So that's a great way to start learning about a specific industry if you're trying to break into one. And then as you do that, you will start understanding where else to look. You'll hear about organizations or maybe professional organizations or groups to then start digging into, and there you can continue building your skill set, experience, knowledge of whatever role you're trying to break into.
Well, I think you brought it up perfectly, and I think a lot of people focus so much on the technology, but the technology really is I wouldn't even say that's necessarily the biggest piece. I would say the old adage in consulting, right, is people, process, technology. Right?
Yep.
You have to understand each aspect of it, because who are the people that you're actually trying to deliver a solution to? That's the first thing. Understand what their process is. And then how does technology either bridge that gap or change their process or change how people think about what their role does?
Yeah. I mean, let's go back to our house analogy. Let's just say the customer says, I want a new kitchen, but maybe you didn't do a good job of understanding how they currently use their existing kitchen. And let's just say, given the budget, you went out and you sourced all these things like an industrial oven, maybe a stove, and you install it and it's great. But at the end of the day, it's like, does it meet what this customer needs to do? What if they don't need 12 burners? What if they don't even know how to cook certain things that require all this fancy technology, quote unquote technology that you've purchased for them, then it's going to be a miss. And then the customer is going to be wondering, hey, why did I pay so much money for all this stuff that it might look good, but I have no idea how to use it, right? So that's something you want to avoid as a consultant in the tech space when you're trying to help customers kind of meet their goals, and especially now, I would say in the I'll just call it the post-pandemic macroeconomic situation, right? A lot of companies trying to be more productive with what they have, looking at their budgets, and just trying to maximize existing value.
Okay, so I think you just hit the nail on the head on what I wanted to pivot to next. You said maximize existing value, which is sort of the adage of what we hear in customer success. Which now I want to pivot the conversation. If you had all this background from working at Deloitte, and working in professional services, then you come to Salesforce. And we worked in a customer success role.
Right.
Let's dive a little bit into that. Like what is customer success? And I know there's various roles, right? Like I would say customer success is more of an overarching umbrella than just necessarily one role. But why don't we talk about what we both started out doing at Salesforce, and then we can discuss our experiences there.
Well, even before that, I would say you have to ask, if you're going into customers or if you're interested in that, like you said, Dom, it's a broad kind of category, and every company will be defining customer success in a different way, right? So at Salesforce, their definition, or at the time when we joined, it was all about trying to help customers improve the usage of what they've purchased, right? And hopefully, because they've improved the usage and are happy with what they have, then they were going to buy more when their contract comes up for renewal. And also, we're going to minimize any software or licenses that they're going to get rid of because they either are unhappy or didn't use it during the contract term. I mean, that was, when you and I first started, we were in what we called it pre-sales, right? So we were helping the sales teams position services, content, things that would help a customer kind of jumpstart that usage. So that once they signed, it's like, okay, I signed the contract, or it's like, hey, I have the key to the brand new house I just finished or bought. Now what do I do? Right? Like, how do I use these things that are in the house? So we were trying to minimize that. I'll just call it the adoption curve, so that they could use it quickly, feel good about it, feel like, hey, we're getting our money's worth, and then continue growing on the Salesforce platform.
It was fun times. I think the thing though that I always tell people in customer success, or that are looking at those roles, is that they change very often because to what you say, like in some companies that I've seen, like customer success, or even if we'll just use the role that most people think of when they think of customer success, the customer success manager. I've seen some companies where the CSM is actually responsible for the renewal. Like I've seen that happen before. Where I've seen it in areas where they're sort of like almost to that bridge of support and not necessarily support and implementation, and try to kind of build a relationship, almost like an account management function to a certain degree. But every company I've talked to has a different definition of what it is, which I think that's an interesting and I would say exciting too, because like I said, you don't just go in like a salesperson, you have to sell, right? CSM, your responsibilities can change, which is, I think, good, but then also it can be a little bit, it's not necessarily for the faint of heart either.
I think, to your point, I think the world that we live in now with cloud-based solutions, whether it's software as a service, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, because of that ability to theoretically jump from one vendor to another, the importance of having your solutions be what we call sticky, so that customers keep using it is super important. And back to your other point of how we used to see define customer success at Salesforce. You think about a circle, and on the circle there's three main roles. There's sales, there's the customer success manager or agent, and then there's renewals, right? So those three are related. So in our world, maybe not in the very beginning, but by the time I left, certainly by the time you left, those roles were very much in collaboration with each other, right?
Yeah.
So you can't work in isolation. But you did mention, however, how companies define things differently. And I have seen where other companies, and maybe because they're smaller, maybe they just don't need it yet, but I've seen other companies where they have those three roles working in silos, which to me doesn't necessarily make sense, because if you don't understand what sales is doing, and if you don't understand what the customer's been telling renewals, or when renewals been telling the customer, how are you as the customer success manager or someone in customer success supposed to address what challenges there might be? Or how are you supposed to help sales if they think this customer is a big bet and they're trying to close a big deal for the year, right? So I've seen different flavors of it in different companies. Some other companies, their version of customer success is primarily implementation focused and support focused, but that's only because they're just getting started. They're very small, and their goal for that company is to get more market share or get their product out the door and have more customers that are successful, so that we can use them as a reference for sales to sell more to other customers, right? So
yeah, it's almost like there's a maturity curve where exactly what you're saying. At the beginning, all these hats sort of fall into what the CSM is, and as it goes more well defined, right?
Yeah.
The roles get more and more defined, but they need to get more collaborative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like even in my current role, I'm using my CSMs on the accounts that I'm working from a pre-sale standpoint.
Yeah.
They're the ears on the ground for new use cases a lot of times. And then they'll bring it to us. And I'm even seeing that right now, where I see that there's more of a metric for some CSMs to even help bring potential opportunities to the table.
Yeah. You're actually, in larger customers, you are the ears in the ground for the salespeople.
Yep.
Because salespeople have multiple accounts, right? Unless you're a sales rep who has one large, what we call enterprise account that has millions of dollars a year, that's a slightly different story. But most customers, the sales rep has several customers. They're busy meeting their customers every week, every month. So your job as a customer success manager is also to be their eyes and ears on the ground, because you're there either on site or you're working with the same stakeholders to help improve that adoption, right? So in the natural course of those interactions, you're going to hear about other groups that either you come across and they might say, hey, this is an interesting solution you're starting or using. We'd like to look more into it, right? And if that group isn't using, or they don't have any licenses, you've now identified another group within that company that potentially sales could sell into, right?
Yeah, I mean that's totally how it plays out, especially in the enterprise, for sure. That's the same thing. And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting role to kind of what we were talking about, where people don't fully understand what it is, but also I think that the direction to get into that role, it's very interesting, because I feel like you get asked the backgrounds of a lot of CSMs.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over the place. Some of them are ex-salespeople. Some of them came from support. I would say a lot of them come from like the implementation, background, project management, like you and I did. Yeah. But it's interesting how that role has sort of become the mesh. It's become a melding of, I would say, all of these things together. It's support, it's implementation, but it's also sales too. All kind of melded together into one type of, I would say, role. And some people are more technical, some people are more salesy, some people are more relationship driven. I feel like there's so many different shades of what the role can be, and it differs for each company, which again, kind of what we talk about.
Absolutely. I think for me, my implementation experience, or my experience back at Deloitte, installing software, building solutions, that really helped me when I came to Salesforce. Even before Salesforce, it helped me in Oracle, because you're putting yourself in the shoes of a customer. They buy something, they may not have the skill set to install or implement, so they've hired a third party, right? Or they hire the consultants from that specific company. But it helps you to really understand when they have a challenge or issue, why that issue happened, or probably how it got to that point, right? And you can then work with the customer. It doesn't necessarily mean I always had the answer, right? by no means.
It's never about having the answer in consulting or customer success.
Right. It's all about
how to get the answer.
Yeah, it's all about relating to the customer, saying, "Hey, okay, this happened. Regardless of why it happened or how it happened, this is our plan to move forward," right? And you know the construct or the kind of infrastructure that you need to do to move forward, right? And again, that moves into then, depending on where you are, what are the other resources we need to pull in, right? So you have to know other teams available at your company. You've got to work with sales because the customer is probably going to go back to sales. Hey, I want a refund or I want some type of credit, right? So there's a lot of collaboration happening to address some of these things. So I would say to your other point of, what experience might help as if you're moving into customer success. For me, it was implementation. But at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to be a computer science person. You don't necessarily have to be someone who is a great developer or coder, right? I think the more important skills are, can you relate to the customer? Can you build that relationship, right? And if you have a team, obviously, how do you manage that team? How do you manage escalations, right? How do you manage escalations from customer stakeholders who might be a VP or CEO who are really angry, right? Or in situations where things are going great, how do you manage that? And then how do you report back to your own teams, whether that's your own team of customer success managers or sales, right? To give them an update of, hey, we sold this 3 months ago. Here's where they are with implementation. Here's the plan for go live, which then means if you're trying to sell more in the next quarter or so, this is what you might want to start thinking about. And by the way, as we're talking to them, we've heard these things as well. So let's incorporate that into your next talk track.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are the skills. I would say the other thing I would say in general, even to make it even simpler, is I would say the key part of customer success is customer, right? So any customer facing work, getting in front of a customer, being able to present, being able to talk, being able to ask questions.
Yeah.
That's the gist of this role. Is like, again, a lot of it is being able to do the research, because you being on calls isn't going to be always what it is. But then you also have to think the stakeholders that you're working with aren't just your customer, it's your salespeople, it's people on support, it's all these various teams. And I always try to tell people, like, if you think of each of those different groups as customers too as well, and how what they care about, I think that's the empathy that moves people forward in these types of roles.
And again, it's not being it's not always being right, or not not always having the answer when the customer asks you a question, right? Customers are always going to ask you a question.
You're not going to know it all.
And depending on your relationship, sometimes they just want to ask questions to ask and say, hey, what do you think about this? That, to me, when I get to the point where customers start asking more theoretical or hypothetical questions, you know that the relationship is pretty solid, because they're now spitballing with you. They're not thinking about their strategy. Hey, what do you think about this, right? And you may not have the answer, but from your experience and from what you know, you can help them see where they influence maybe what direction they want to go, right?
You can ask them why are they even asking that? Like, what is the why? What is the question behind the question? Is what we
exactly. Yeah.
It could be the most consultant answer ever. It depends.
I would say talking with customers and not being afraid to just get in the mix, right? To help them understand, right? Obviously, it's going to be different if you're doing a pure implementation and you're running a weekly project status meeting and there's issues. Okay, that's a little bit more tactical, a little bit different, but still, you're going to have to be managing different, what we call swim lanes, or different tasks. And again, you still have to know, you're not going to know the answer, but you're going to have to know, how do we escalate? How do we follow a established protocol that both we and the customer have agreed to? What's this going to impact? Do we bring in sales, right? So those are all things that you get used to and figure out and learn as a consultant.
Totally get that, man. Well, hey, I think we're pretty close to I would say ending this here. I would just say, before we end this, what if you had to give anyone just some lasting advice if they wanted to either get into consulting, or they wanted to get into customer success? Like, what's the best quick one-liner that you would say to get to that point?
Two things, actually. So talk to your network. You'll be surprised at who you can get introduced to through your network, and see who you can kind of get in front of in terms of talking about their experience, right? If it's a specific company, see who you can get introduced to. And also, like we mentioned before, look at the companies that you're interested in, or just maybe go to some of the larger tech companies like Salesforce or Amazon or Microsoft or Google, right? Any of the big ones, and see what they offer in terms of free resources to get trained up around customer success, around consulting. Because a lot of the stuff, you start taking some of these things and getting through them, and maybe you get a certificate here, certification, or a badge, but you'll start seeing trends. You'll start seeing themes that are very similar. And the more you know, and the more you understand how different companies define things, that will really help in terms of getting your foot in the door for your next role.
Totally agree. I think the last thing I was going to say is I always tell this to folks too, and I realize I didn't bring this up on here. I would say one of the easiest ways to be an entrepreneur is to be a consultant and become really good at something, and then just bill yourself out. Like, if you can build those skills where you can charge a dollar amount for it, like, that has a lot. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. It's definitely not. There's a lot that goes into it. But instead of you building a quote unquote product or company from scratch, I know a lot of folks that are just working as contractors, but they create their own company. They build themselves out. You know, you'll hear terms like corp to corp and things like that. But great way, you know, to monetize those skills that you learn from any of these roles. I was planning on doing it right before COVID.
And that's a great, I would say, not end goal, but a great kind of goal to have. If you're starting out consulting, obviously if you start out from undergrad, you have no experience. People know that. So it's great to join a bigger company or a team so you learn things. But like you said, Dom, as you keep doing these things, you're going to see the trends. And if you stay in a specific, it doesn't have to be an industry. It can just be what we call product or focus area. Maybe you want to focus on security. Maybe you want to focus on risk analysis. It could be any integration. It could be anything these days. But as you start building that experience, and over time, right? Maybe after, I don't want to put a specific time frame, but it could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you become an expert. And obviously you have to stay on top of the trends to keep fresh, but you become the expert, and then you can bill yourself out, right? You could be a contractor at a company because you're the only person that knows this kind of skill set, or you create a company and you find other customers, and then you build your own team, right?
I think that's a good way of ending it, right? So thanks again, Barron, for the time, and really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks a lot.